I can develop an, oh, whoops. Now we're recording. Can develop an integrated climate action plan report. When I'm using the word report just to differentiate between broader climate action planning. So we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like. A lot of municipalities also incorporate climate action into existing planning processes, comprehensive plans, open space plans, all of the broad range of planning exercises that municipalities go through. So we can talk a little, Kelly's going to talk a little bit about what that looks like in our region. And then third is that they can partner with local, regional, and state organizations to further advance climate action planning or climate actions of all kinds. So these are kind of the three ways in which municipalities do engage. And really, like, I think the drivers behind the ways that municipal government decides to engage really depends on capacity, on funding, on the time and energy and resources they have, and also a lot of times on the political will to engage in any one of these, because obviously all of these take time, energy, and resources, and it's sort of a constant balancing of trying to decide sort of what the best approach is, and it really depends on community values as well. That's a big driver of the ways in which municipalities decide to engage on climate change. And we see a broad range in our region. You know, across all of Portland, there are communities that have full climate action plans or are working towards that. There are those that are really working in like more limited ways on energy plans or specifically on resilience. So it really is a reflection of the values that a community holds. So when we talk about a climate action plan report, what we're saying is, you know, an integrated report that identifies climate action strategies that both achieve emission reductions and also build resilience. And this is usually developed either through engaging with a consultant or a committee, which Denny will talk about today. We've had volunteer committees that have developed full climate action plans, or it could be staff-led. That's usually not the case because staff usually have a lot of other things that is on their plates, but there is, you know, a range of ways in which communities might develop a climate action plan. The process itself really hopefully ensures resident engagement and staff and council support, and a process through which you can help and understand what a community's priorities are. And I think that's, you know, what we want an integrated and successful climate action plan to identify, is to reflect the town priorities and values, and to really help us to establish like a framework for decision making in the future, so they can reference back to it and know these are the targets we set, and the reason that we're investing in this project or in deciding to change this policy or ordinance is because of this, you know, this document we created that kind of sets the strategy for the town and identifies our values. So GPCOG engages with several, or engaged right now with several of our member communities in doing climate action planning. We've created a process that's really based on best practices, but also, you know, leveraging as much as possible the work that the state has done with Maine 108 and that One Climate Future, which is the shared climate action plan between Portland and South Portland, created. There's a ton of good information. You know, nobody needs to reinvent the wheel. We have a list of resources that we're going to share, and we can put some in the chat, I think, as well. But there's, you know, there is no one exact right way to do a climate action plan. We've created a way that works well for us in the technical assistance that we provide to communities. So it really starts more generally with the you know, preparation and data collection process, with the goal of creating a greenhouse gas emissions inventory, so data about the emissions that occur in a town. And then a vulnerability assessment, which sort of sets the baseline understanding of what type of vulnerable assets, ecosystems, specific populations are vulnerable to climate change now and in the future. So it's taking, you know, existing data that the state has pulled together about climate hazards in the future and understanding how those impact a certain context within communities. We do a series of department head interviews and surveys so we can understand, you know, what assets do staff manage right now in a town, what impacts are they already seeing, and then do a significant amount of mapping and data collection where we kind of help to identify how those assets might be impacted in the future, and habitats, ecosystems, et cetera. There is a wide range of data available, that some of it is better than others, some of it is outdated. You know, we're constantly working with imperfect data, and that is not, it shouldn't be a hindrance. I think we just use what we have to the best of our ability, and especially, with emissions inventory specifically, but also with vulnerability assessments, we want to get a sense of the trends, right? It is less about measuring every last ton of GHG emissions and less about knowing exactly how many inches of sea level rise there's going to be, and understanding of trends and directions for a community and how to use those to do some long-term planning. So once we have the baselines for those two things, we move into action planning. And throughout this, there's a number of surveys, community engagement exercises that we go to ensure that we're getting as much input as possible from the community to understand, like I said, what their values are. That really is going to drive the process. In the climate action planning section, we set emission inventory reduction goals early on. So those goals help drive the actions that we identify that will be a part of the plan. And it's the same with vulnerability. If there are certain, very vulnerable assets, we'll identify those in the adaptation section of the plan to show, to help communities understand how they need to either adapt their infrastructure or, work on protecting ecosystems or conserving land, et cetera. So all of that, the baseline setting really is what drives the action planning section. And then we work with communities on implementation plans, which is really where the rubber meets the road and the very hard part of understanding who is going to do what, who is responsible, and getting the level of specificity down where you understand what you need to achieve by when, but then there's a lot of flexibility in how those actions are rolled out or achieved, because you want to make sure that in implementation, a town there's lots of different ways, and there may be different technologies in the future that they can use to achieve their goals. So we want to make it's really a balance of making it as specific as possible to understand how you're going to reach your goals, and then leaving flexibility. So that's a very quick, high level look at our process of engagement for community, for climate action planning. It usually takes about a year. It can take more, it can take less. I mean, I haven't seen it take less, but it could potentially take less time. But really, to do the amount of community engagement that you want to do and get as much input as possible from staff, elected, everybody, it just takes, about a year. So Kelly, I'm going to hand it over to you, and Kelly's going to talk a little bit about how beyond a full climate action plan, the ways in which towns are integrating into existing planning processes.
Thanks, Sarah. So some towns aren't at a place where they can complete a climate action plan, whether they don't have the full support, they don't have interest, funding, but that doesn't mean that your town can't still integrate climate actions and strategies across different departments. And a lot of times I think towns think it needs to rely on, one sustainability coordinator or an environmental planner, but really there's a lot of things you can do across the department or across all staff to make sure that everyone's on board for climate action planning. And in fact, even at a workshop I was at last night, someone was asking, can our town, just hire someone to do all of this? And while that's ideal, a lot of towns can't always just add a new staff person. And so that's where you really want to get all of your staff on board and saying, hey, we can incorporate these climate actions into different processes that are already in place to help make our town more sustainable and resilient to climate change. So Sarah, next slide. So you can really start to kind of establish internal standards, processes. One way to do this that most towns have to go through is a comprehensive plan. Set a big goal, strategy, big idea to be climate resilient, to incorporate those sustainability strategies. Set a benchmark with an EV benchmark or energy benchmarks within your comprehensive plan. You can also, in your comprehensive plan, say, hey, within the next 10 years, we want to create a climate action plan, or we want to do a full greenhouse gas inventory. Try and include climate data in any plans that you're using, and to look forward and understand, okay, in the future, these projects, these growth areas, what is it going to look like with climate change? And then even other plans, open space plans, neighborhood plans, agricultural plans, all of them can work to increase your sustainability and your resilience to climate action. Next slide. Another way is through the budgeting process. So, sometimes we've heard that sometimes projects are chosen just because of cost and not really looked at the full spectrum of what benefits it can provide. So try and work with the municipality to target a number of projects to be funded related to sustainability, and prioritize those projects based on their benefits, or if they benefit certain vulnerable populations more than the other. And just try and ensure that some infrastructure improvements might provide public benefits. A sidewalk, for example, helps improve sustainability and encourages walking. And so those are great things to invest. And so you can balance out the cost of something with the public health benefits and the climate action benefits. Next slide. There are then a ton of ordinances that you can do. And all of it can help set you up to design for the future climate in mind and thinking about your existing vulnerabilities. You can set a EV ordinance. South Portland and Scarborough, I know, or at least have passed or are in development for EV ordinance for any new development to make sure that it's EV ready in the future. You could adopt the stretch building code. You can set landscape ordinances and promote native vegetation and reduce pesticides. You can also put in building codes, flood, shoreline codes. You also want to make sure that any of these ordinances that you set are backed by the council and are enforceable. We've talked with code enforcement officers where they say that's great. We want to incorporate these ordinances, but that doesn't mean that it's always followed. And so make sure things can be followed up on and that they actually can get implemented, and that all of the staff are trained to ensure that these ordinances go through. So this is just kind of a brief example. You are free to kind of look up, and there's a ton more ordinances to choose from that all can relate to climate action. And that kind of leads into a lot of the communication, outreach, and education. So, again, as I said, make sure that there is kind of collaboration across departments, clear messaging on climate action, making sure that everyone is trying to buy in or understand why this might be beneficial to the public and themselves. A lot of times all of these can save the municipal staff money, which everyone likes to save money. So that's always a good thing. But it also ensures that you do engage with the public and that they are on board. They're often the ones who are driving this, and so you can have their support. And then you can also consider different lending programs and incentives. I know a lot of towns actually now along the coast are looking into kind of rebates, incentives for heat pumps, weatherization, electrify everything. In Portland and South Portland, they're developing programs to help reach people to kind of shift their practices. So there's different modes and methods that you can use to kind of increase your climate action across the town without just creating a specific climate action plan. And a lot of that doesn't come without challenges. So there, I think I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks, Kelly. Yeah, so these are some of the things, Kelly was talking about that we advise our municipal government to do, especially ones that aren't particularly interested or ready yet to jump into climate action planning. So, in all of these things, municipalities encounter challenges, and I think it's always helpful to, especially for residents, who may not have worked in local government before, to understand the challenges, and the constraints within that a lot of local governments are working within. So one of those, and I think we all understand, especially right now in this, post-COVID great reshuffling, there's severely limited staff availability oftentimes in municipal government. There is hundreds of open planning positions across the state right now. We have a real lack of planning staff in the state of Maine. So I think that's a good example of the ways in which the towns are often constrained to act. Time and speed is always a factor. Municipal processes can be a lot slower. Committees meet once a month, councils meet once a month. There's very full agendas. They're trying to get a lot of services provided and things done. And I think it can be frustrating sometimes to residents how slowly some of these things progress, which we understand. Ensuring that there is council support. There's always political pressures. There's frequent elections. Especially in Maine, which is a very purple state. There are real political constraints that we work within. I think, especially in local government. So balancing those pressures can be challenging. And then funding, I think. In the past, and luckily it's not as much of a challenge right now. There's really been an explosion in federal funding, but also luckily state funding, and having a very supportive governor has helped in terms of the funding that's available to support local action. So, but tax dollars are always hard to come by and very hard to spend. So I think it's always all of us a challenge, and making sure that you're providing value for your taxpayers. So I think these are some of the challenges that we see, and recognizing that the municipalities often lack capacity. That's one of our roles as a regional planning organization, and the role of a lot of our partners who are here today and that we're going to talk about is really to help expand that capacity. And that's a huge piece of what I think volunteers can do for municipalities, is really to help increase that capacity for them. So in those challenges, I
wanted to draw you just to 2 questions in the chat before we move on about the manners of going about this work. So first was, any examples of municipalities that have incorporated climate change in open space plans, and also model ordinances?
Great. Off the top of my head, potentially, well, so I know Bridgeton's working on an open space plan right now that I know they're going to be incorporating sustainability, I think, into climate considerations. Kelly, do you know of any? And if anybody else, I definitely do not know all the things that are happening. So anybody else is free to put in the chat answers as well. In terms of open space plans, we have some great examples of full climate action plans that we can share. In terms of open space plans, I'm not sure.
I don't know any off the top of my head, and we're not as involved with open space plans. I know it's also, a lot of towns are looking into it right now, and wanting to either create or update them. So
yeah, we can share as become available. Model ordinances, I know Southern Maine Planning Development Commission are here. They have some great model ordinances on their website. We can add those links to our link document as well for like coastal ordinances. And we have a model ordinance on our Maine Clean Communities page for electric vehicles, for charging for electric vehicles. So I'll post that as well. So there are some things, and there's always more, I think, being developed. And actually, South Portland did already adopt their electric vehicle charging ordinance. So you can just go and look at that. It's on their website, I believe. Oh, great. And Denny has a comment in the chat as well. So other opportunities, to help support municipalities, I think obviously capacity is huge, like I said, and, we've seen the volunteer committees, official committees of councils are really important in adding capacity across our communities. And that is for even the best resource community down to the least resource community. I think volunteer committees are really, really essential. We always suggest that municipalities seek as much community input as possible. Residents know their town best and really oftentimes have a lot of great ideas. I think, municipalities that really empower grassroots efforts can like get more done more quickly. Actually, a good example yesterday, the Freeport Climate Action Network called Freeport CAN, I think they call themselves. They have got Freeport Council to consider adopting a stretch code. So they did that faster than, certainly the municipal staff would have, I think, or others. So I think there are really great examples of ways in which grassroots efforts can kind of push the agenda a little faster than municipal staff may move. I also always encourage to municipalities to be transparent as possible on progress that's being made, and share updates with committees and with council as much as possible. Supporting committees and advocating for climate action. I think municipalities can really help, give their committees the resources they need in order to make the argument. And as a regional organization, we are here to help share the experiences of our towns that are doing climate action and or adopting particular ordinances or things, just to share that, nobody's doing this alone. We are all sort of trying to lead on this effort. So that is always very helpful, I think, in helping convince councils, that they're not out alone and there are other municipalities working on this with them. And then sharing funding opportunities, I think, for residents that you may come across funding opportunities, sharing them with the municipalities and the municipalities sharing those, like that exchange of information that happens about, hey, we know we have this project in mind. Did you hear about this funding opportunity? Like, I think that is always a great way to help support staff, but also for staff to help engage with community members as well. So I just wanted to highlight real quick all of our partner organizations who are working in this space alongside of us, because a lot of the work that they are doing makes our work possible, but also expands on it. And a couple good examples, the Gulf of Maine Research Institute has a community science flood monitoring project that engages volunteers in taking pictures of sites that flood frequently in our coastal communities. So this is a great way, you basically sort of a collaborative science effort where you can upload pictures of flooding and they collect that information and then connect it to weather events and storm information, so we understand what types of weather events may cause particular levels of inundation and what infrastructure might be impacted. So this is a really great way to kind of engage citizens in science. And they're working on getting a lot of our communities in Portland signed up right now. Maine Clean Communities is hosted by Greater Portland Council of Governments, and this supports electrification and charging across the whole state of Maine. The Community Resilience Partnership obviously is a funding opportunity from the Governor's Office of Policy Innovation in the Future, which is providing funding directly to local municipalities to do actions. Casco Bay partners, our partners here, New England Environmental Finance Center, there's just like a huge range of groups. And we have a lot of these links in the links document that we'll share. And these are all great places to start and to reach out to. Local land trusts are a great place to reach out to and get involved in, because this network of collaborative partners really makes all of this work possible in the region. Great. Oh, good. You'll put a link to where you can sign up to be a citizen scientist. So in terms of the ways in which sort of we've seen communities lead, and I'll just do this as an introduction to Denny and Jody, who's going to talk about community engagement in their communities. So obviously the best way, I think, is always to join a committee or board to engage really in education and engagement in your community. We'll talk a little bit about advocacy and then in grassroots organizing. So in terms of a community board, like I said, these really increase the capacity of municipalities. We usually advise that a municipality that's setting up a climate action plan establishes a climate action planning committee to help advise through that process. So you can help advise in decision making, especially around efficiency emission reduction targets, and help really advocate to the council. But also, if you don't have a climate action planning committee in your community, joining planning boards, joining conservation committees, energy committees, there's a broad range of committees that can help support and integrate climate considerations into municipal operations more. So education engagement, talk to your neighbors, now that we're in a post-COVID world, I think a little bit engaging with neighbors, going to community meetings, understanding who in the community might not be being heard from on a regular basis. I always it's hard to go to community meetings when you have small children. It's very hard to go to community meetings if you're elderly or don't have a car. So making sure, as more privileged members of our community, that we are ensuring that there's a more, inclusive amount of voices being heard. And I think that can be, like we said, you all know your communities best. And so who in your community might not be represented. And so we really encourage all volunteer committees to kind of think about stakeholders in your team, in your town, and how they could best be reached. It might not be through like your standard public engagement meeting at 6 p.m. on a Tuesday or 7 p.m. on a Tuesday. There might be other ways, tabling at farmers markets, or, going to particular community-based organizations and using those to reach out. I think there's just lots of different ways that residents are better at outreach, frankly, than municipal staff might be. So again, advocacy, I think, advocating at the local, the regional, and the state level is a great way to get involved, attending council meetings, sending emails to counselors, making sure that they hear from people who are supportive of climate action. And obviously, we're happy right now to have a state governor and legislature that is supportive of climate action, but there are always lots of ways to get involved in supporting different legislation at the state level. And like I said, grassroots efforts. I think Freeport Climate Action Network is a great example. I know the Portland Committee, Sustainability Committee is very active. A lot of these committees do education, like educational series and workshops, or in-person get-togethers. A lot of them might have like electric vehicle ride-in drives, which we're always happy to help support. So finding, figuring out who's doing what in your neighborhood and joining in. So I'm going to pass it over to Denny from Cumberland, and he can talk a little bit about his experience. And Denny, I can advance your slides for you. Oh, I think you just need to unmute yourself.
Good afternoon. My granddaughter gave me a little bit of a cold, so I might have to clear my throat as we move forward. But I'm very pleased to be here. And the first thing that I want to say about where I am in all of this is I've become, I might almost say, an extreme optimist about the prospects for the future. I started out with Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth. I got excited about that, and then that had a long period of backlash. There were few answers at the time, mostly conservation type answers. And now we move forward to a period where basically all the solutions, at least that I can see, have now been developed, particularly with a recent action in green hydrogen. So now we have a complete suite of tools to get the problem solved. And the pace is picking up extremely rapidly, as I'll say right here in our town. We have a climate action plan I'll describe, and we're ahead of the game already. So I'm optimistic, and I really hope everyone here can share my enthusiasm for getting things done. Our town is relatively small, a population of 8,500 people. It's primarily residential, a very small business community. No rental properties to speak of. So 80% of the the greenhouse gas emissions come from the residential sector. We have some other distinctive characteristics. We're on the waterfront, but we don't really have a waterfront that's in danger because all of the waterfront is on high bluffs. So unlike our neighbors at Yarmouth and Scarborough, sea level rise is not going to present a difficulty to us, as it turns out. We're very heavily forested, 60% forested, so natural systems have been a big part of our climate action plan, as I'll describe. So in 2019, what we did was work through our Lands and Conservation Commission. We used to have an energy committee, but it went out of business for lack of things to do. So I joined the Conservation Commission and got them enthusiastic about building on our comprehensive plan of 2009 to creating a climate action plan subcommittee. Now, this is a step that I would really recommend to other towns, is to engage the town council in validating this effort. So we created a charter and asked the town council to vote on it and put us in business. And we set out a 2-year time frame, and I can't tell you how many times the fact that the town council had approved this work made it much easier to get things done. It wasn't a heavy lift because we weren't asking for much. We were just asking for the right to write a plan. And so we did an inventory and we proposed a set of goals. And what I'm going to take you through now is just a couple of slides that talks about what we found out and what we have done to date. So the baseline we did on an amateur basis. I'm an economist by training, so it wasn't too difficult for me to work through it. But you have a lot of towns have a lot of resources with GPCOG and others to help with this what seems like a tough task, but it can be finished pretty quickly. So on the left here, by sector, 79% of the emissions are from households. The school district and the town, relatively small, 1% and 7%, and the small business sector is 13%. And that's a little iffy because we don't really have good data yet. We're going to try to get more information there. And then by use, 37% basically automobiles, individuals driving cars, heating of homes, electricity use, and waste is 4%. So you can move on to the next slide. So we came up with a set of actions and made estimates on the carbon emissions that would be avoided. This is the second phase of our plan, which is households and small business. And we have these 10 actions. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I'll just highlight a few. The big one was home energy use. So promoting heat pumps was going to be the major home run. Transport, that's basically residential vehicular. And the next two have to do with natural systems. We found that 30% of the land area in Cumberland is lawns, residential lawns. And by making small changes in the landscaping practices of homeowners, which we're into quite deeply at the moment, doing some conferences at the library, could have a big impact on carbon emissions. And I'm not aware of any other towns that have kind of gone at that, although I notice that South Portland has picked up something. But in our town, just because of who we are, that was a big lever. And the second was to adopt a 30 by 30 goal of conserving 30% of Cumberland's lands, which is, the stretch goal for the Biden administration. We, as it turns out, our town owns outright 1,000 acres. 30% would be 3,000. We have a land trust that's got land under conservation, and if you throw in tree growth, we're already at 21%. So the goal is to get to another 1,000 acres in the next 10 years. Maybe now is the time just to briefly touch on something that I put in the chat, is that this was unrelated really to the Climate Action Plan. It came out of our survey work back along in the old plan, the comprehensive plan. A lot of interest on the part of people living here on open space. So the conservation subdivision ordinance, which we approved, it took a bit of time, but went through the planning board, is that any new development in Cumberland has to set aside 50% open space, for which the developer gets a reduced lot size. And so that's where we're going, so that as development happens, which it will in town, half of that property is going to drop into open space. And looking at the profile of our land holdings at the moment, I feel fairly certain that by 2030, just the natural course of development plus the way that conservation subdivision works, it's going to produce another 1,000 acres of open space just through that ordinance. So that's a big one that I would people who have open land might want to consider. We have an activity on composting and food waste that's pretty good. We have adopted the stretch goal. The town council has. So if I can just get here to this next slide. So this is a graphic that kind of startled us when we put it together. So over on the left is the 2015 baseline of tons emitted by our households. 23, it's about 50,000 tons. And the actions that I just described to you are these are the results of the actions. So the big one is heat pumps, which would cut it almost in half. And I will say remarkably that last year, 10% of our households added heat pumps. So at a rate of 10% a year, we're going to get there before 2030. And that's just because it's a good program and people are getting it, you know, air conditioning and whatnot. Many of the new houses that are being built are being done entirely with heat pumps without any natural gas. So that's great. High efficiency vehicles, we're just assuming that we'll get the kind of adoption that, you know, that's happening out there. And in fact, EVs are sprouting up all over town. So that's becoming quite popular. The land conservation and other activities, if all implemented, would turn our entire residential sector into a carbon sink, or what we call climate positive. So we could visualize a situation here, if we get all this done, that the town of Cumberland, because of its nature and because of its natural systems and forest cover, could be a carbon sink for the rest of the world, which is pretty terrific, which is why, you know, I'm an optimist on that. And the pace is picking up on these actions, so that the staff is getting more comfortable with things, and the people in town and the library are very active in promoting the concepts. So I say that a key step is getting the council on board with giving you permission to do a plan. Do a plan. It doesn't have, as you know, Sarah was saying, it doesn't have to be perfect, but if it's a plan, then people can start working on stuff. And I think you'd be very pleased with how rapidly things, you know, come into fruition. So I'll halt here in case anybody has any questions, or I can come.
Thank you, Danny. Does anybody want to raise their hand? Oh, you've got more slides too.
Yeah, no, I don't. I'm done on the slides. Yeah.
Good. Okay. Anybody have questions for Danny? I can see. Yeah, Tom.
Hi, Denny. Hope you're doing
Hi,
well.
Tom.
Listen,
How you doing?
good. Listen, how did you guys develop the estimates of carbon gas emissions for your town?
Of carbon emissions?
Yes.
Well, I did most of the work on that. I had a few other folks who were knowledgeable. I relied a lot on GPCOG. But as far as the municipal buildings and whatnot, it was basically just going and getting the heating bills and working it out that way. I attended one very good seminar that the folks in York County put on about their method. They have a nice program or a manual on how to deal with some of the areas like commercial sectors. We made some estimates we got from the Maine Department of Transportation, the vehicles traveled in town and the history there, so you can make some assumptions. And then they also did a recent inventory of what we have in terms of miles per gallon. So we, you know, it wasn't perfect, but it was, you know, it gave us confidence that we knew more or less what we were talking about. As far as the natural systems, Tom, you might be interested in this because you and I have talked about this over the years with carbon in forests. Because we have 1,000 acres, we asked our town forest, and we got a Project Canopy grant to do this, to take one of the big forests and do a carbon sequestration analysis of that forest. And because you're in southern Maine, you know, the landscape is more heavily stocked with trees, and we're in a way we're overstocked, I think some might say. Our carbon emissions per acre or sequestration per acre was like 3 to 4 tons per acre per year. So this, when you add it up times the 1,000 acres, it's a big number. And so that's led us to a lot of stuff that I won't talk about here, but I'd be happy to take any questions on it, of how your forests and your wetlands and so on and so, and even the lawns of the citizens can have a surprisingly large impact.
And we can, we'll talk a little bit later about the greenhouse gas inventories and some tools for doing that, but Southern Maine Planning and Development Commission's methodology is really wonderful to help guide in that. And we'll provide a link to it. Anybody else? Feel free to jump in if I can't see your hand.
There's a question in the chat, Sarah. Has there been any effort to increase active walking, rolling, biking, or public transportation options as a way of reducing greenhouse gas emissions from transportation, or has the strategy primarily been to encourage EV adoption?
The latter. Our town is stretched out, and so it isn't convenient to walk. We don't really have a town center. And so because of the comprehensive plan in 2009, we have done sidewalks and built them out. But the idea that our town, as stretched out as it is, could contribute much by walking places. It's nice to have, but it's not gonna move the needle very much.
Yeah, I think the state and the state climate action plan, there is a target to reduce vehicle miles traveled, and that's something that we think a lot about at GPCOG with our PAX communities that are more urban and public transportation focused. And the state is working on various ways to help improve, reduce the vehicle miles traveled for rural communities as well, but it's a very tough nut to crack in a car dominated culture and in a large state like Maine. So
but the cars themselves, that's pretty remarkable. I can remember 20 years ago, people talking about it would be a miracle if we could have miles per gallon over 50.
Yeah.
There was a guru whose name I'm forgetting who designed a hypercar, that could do this. And now, the plug-in hybrids are all 50 to 70 miles per gallon. And that's a lot of reduction from the baseline. So I think the automobile fleet is cleaning itself up pretty rapidly.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you, Denny. We really appreciate you attending, and Cumberland has done some really impressive things with very few resources. So it's great to hear. And I'm going to hand it over to Jody now from Aroustic. We've got some slides from her.
Thank you. Really appreciate the optimism and how far ahead Denny and those folks are from us. We're just beginning. So you can go on to the next slide. So we are a very small town, an island-based town just south of Bath and just before you get to Georgetown, just to let folks know where we are. Next slide. We are small in every shape and form. We're like 10 miles from the top to the bottom and 1.5 miles wide. And you can see here that we have a limited number of residents, households, housing units. We don't have a business district, and we're all dependent on wells and septic systems. Next slide. And we are fortunate to be surrounded by the Kennebec estuary, which is, ecologically significant and has 20% of the state's wetlands, estuarine wetlands here, of which are in the process of being protected. So those are a key part of our personality. We also have a lot of issues. This is the road into town, just past the bridge during the December storm, and it does get flooded frequently, not as much as this. And we have a few other roads. So really, infrastructure is one of the motivating factors for our residents. Next slide. So we started to get organized around the Conservation Commission to become to join the partnership. And we knew that one of the requirements was to host a workshop. And so we worked with our partnership supporting organizations to create a flyer. They did the design for us. We got the information to them. And next slide. And I think the most effective thing that we did was the folks on the Conservation Commission took their neighborhoods and went door to door and knocked on their neighbors. So there's familiar faces. And if we didn't see people weren't home when we knocked on the doors. We just slipped it in their door with a little note on it, signed our names. And people really enjoyed talking to us and meeting us. And just that personal contact was, I heard over and over again, it was so great to get that. So that was really the crux of how we got people to our workshop. Next slide. We also did the more traditional and email blast. We tried to make our message positive, relatable, like, preparing is like putting on a seatbelt, and it's going to be more expensive if we don't do something now. Next slide. We also sent either an email or letters to student households and encouraged young people to come, that their voices were important, that this is their future, and we wanted to hear from them. So that was also another thing we did to get people to come. Next slide. And we had very specific goals that we, publicized, that we wanted their input on. So those were the 3 goals. Next slide. We were shocked and excited that we had 58 participants at least, and there were some that didn't sign in, and 11% of our student population. So we were kind of bowled over by that. Next slide. So the organization, I think, was really important to the success and will be important to our next workshop. We, had a welcoming. We always had, homemade snacks, which is always a draw, introducing and keeping it very friendly. Next slide. And we created breakout groups with specific questions that folks had to, we wanted people to answer, and we let them self-select which group they were most interested in. Next slide. And I think the most important part here is that in organizing it, the most time was dedicated to hearing the voices of the people who came to the workshop. So the breakout groups were the longest part, and I didn't highlight it, but also the reporting out was a big part. And we had Victoria there to show that it was sort of a statewide effort, which we appreciated, but the local folks, the chair of the Conservation Commission, and another young person who's really good, Jesse, was talking a little bit about why this was important. Next slide. And I think, we at each breakout group, we had a facilitator who had experience facilitating and a note taker, so that all people's great ideas were captured. Next slide. And the takeaways from our outreach effort was that it was really more than just a requirement for the partnership. It got people excited and involved. The results from the workshop are being incorporated into the Climate Action Plan that we got funding from GoPIF to launch, which we've done. And we're going to use this and also some learnings that we had to create the next workshop, one of which I think we're going to have the children's corners to provide childcare. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Jody. That's great. That's a really great turnout for that event. That's really exciting and really good ideas for engagement and how to reach the community. Questions. It looks like we have one in the chat from Denny. Do you all have plans to measure your carbon sequestration given the Kennebec estuary in your climate action plan?
I don't know.
Maybe.
That would be good, but we also 30% of our land base is also currently in conservation. So we have a lot of great sequestration going on. I think that is probably, we'll probably highlight that, but I think marsh migration is really something that we're going to be looking closely at.
Great. Yeah, that's really helpful. And actually we can highlight in the tools a tool for kind of looking at marsh migration as well. Great. Well, if no other questions for Denny and Jody, or if you think of some later, I think they'll stick around. So we'll have another question and answer period at the end, but we just wanted to dive into a few tools. first. So for greenhouse gas inventories, I think that they can be very scary to dive into. A lot of numbers, not all of us are math people. So I just want to highlight one excellent local resource we have with the greenhouse gas inventory protocol, which is really just like it sounds very complicated, but as a step-by-step guide that Southern Maine Planning and Development Commission created. It's what we use to do to kind of guide our greenhouse gas inventories in our region. We use a tool that we've highlighted here from ECLA, which you do have to pay for, but if your community becomes an ECLA network member, then you get the tool for free. So ECLA is just a local governance for sustainability. It's an international network of towns and cities working on sustainability. So it's a member organization, so your town can join, and they have a membership fee that you also get access to this inventory tool, which can help you do the inventory, but then also does some pathway modeling. If you want to set an emission reduction target, it can help you understand how you can get there and what types of actions you would need. So that is a tool that we use with our communities. But if you want to do it just in an Excel sheet, Karina invented for SMPDC also helps walk you through that. So there's lots of options, and please always reach out. Like I said, we do have a document with links that we'll add all the links to these so you can easily reference them. So for vulnerability assessments, we look at a range of data sources. Some are national, some are state level, some are regional, and then we hope to get as much local data as possible. We use census data to look at social, demographic information, which is not always super accurate. And we have challenges that we run into frequently where we try and at least validate, at a local level, a lot of time with food pantries or community-based organizations, churches, about the types of community members that may be more at risk or underrepresented. So we try and validate it at the local level, but there isn't always a lot of local data that's collected about demographics. So we use census data. There was a ton of sea level rise viewers and various ways to kind of look at the ways in which sea level rise and storm surge can impact your community. There's been leaps and bounds better information than there was, 5 or 6 years ago. And lots of different ways to kind of visualize it in a map format, which is always, I think, the best. Just a plug for the Climate Change Adaptation Providers Network. They have a really great website where they list all of the tools. So I didn't want to list them all here because you can just go there and find them all. We'll have that link in our document as well. The Community Intertidal Data Portal is something we developed along with Tidal Bay Consulting and Viewshed, and it is a great sort of map viewer where you can view marsh migration and sea level rise. So you can see as sea levels rise where marshland would need to migrate to, and then you can see if there's any conserved land in that area or if there's development that may prevent the marshland from migrating. So there's some great resources there for coastal communities, but there are also the Maine Flood Resilience Checklist is a wonderful self-assessment for flood hazards. There isn't as much good inland data, unfortunately, for flooding, but there is starting to be, and there are ways in which we have some proprietary data that we have access to that we use with our inland communities to see how inland waterways might flood, because that's a significant challenge as well. Road washouts, especially in the storm in December, we saw a ton of road washouts, culverts breaking. So, the increase in precipitation is a big challenge, not just sea level rise. Any questions here? Vulnerability assessments, there is, I also just wanted to highlight the state has created a resource, the Community Resilience Workbook, that they're, I think, going to turn into a website soon, which will also help communities walk through a vulnerability assessment and assessing their resilience. So there are more tools coming. I think there's not, like right now, there's not like a comprehensive, do this first and then do this next, like there is with greenhouse gas inventory. There's kind of a variety of approaches that you can use, and it's slightly more complicated. Any questions on these two areas? or thoughts? I'm sure there are plenty of resources that I have not added here, but there is a lot of national resources. I tried to highlight the ones that are most specific to Maine. Great. So for climate action planning in general, I, like I said, the Maine Community Resilience Workbook, which I do have a link to the draft, but I don't know if it's final. So I think that will be coming out soon. Yeah, Victoria's shaking her head. So I don't think it's final, but soon. I know that Maine Sea Grant and others are working hard to finalize it and get something out to everybody. I personally use the C40 Resource Center, which is a C40 is a group of megacities that do climate action, and they have a really great like step-by-step guide to climate action planning that we'll put the link in. I really consider it like a best. Oh, there we go. Kelly dropped the reference links document, so there's a whole document of links that Kelly just put in the chat. I think it's a great place. And honestly, looking at the climate action plans from One Climate Future, York just put out a great climate action plan, and the state climate action plan for people looking to go down the path of creating a full climate action plan. Those are really good resources for just seeing what types of actions other communities have chosen. There really are like basically a fairly set number of actions that municipalities have control over to do, and there's lots of ways to go about it, but you don't need to reinvent the wheel. I think there's lots, as Denny and Jody showed, there's lots of ways in which you can do, approach actions or approach trying to reduce emissions that feel aligned with the values in your town. But you don't have to like go it alone. There's lots of other, both Portland and South Portland are great leaders in this area. They have energy benchmarking programs that you can hear about. Like we talked about electrify everything campaigns. So it's very easy to sort of learn, I think, from some of the leaders in the region and apply those in your communities. And I just wanted to highlight a project screening tool. Kelly was talking about capital investment and capital budgets. We've been working with some of our municipalities to create a screening tool that can be applied in the capital investment process, where you're looking at a bunch of different projects, sort of how do you not just like pick the cheapest ones to do, or the ones that are sort of most compelling, like maybe from a public works perspective, or but making sure that you sort of assess projects in a more comprehensive way. So we've created a project screening tool that we'll share soon. It's probably through the Community Resilience Partnership, we can share it as a tool. And it just helps like evaluate a project across a variety of areas: equity and community well-being, environmental stewardship, infrastructure, sustainability, and then economic development. So it creates a score so you can see, and it's really flexible, so you can include your own community values within it, because we have kind of a weighting where you can weight certain criteria heavier than others if you're specifically have targets in your climate action plan. So these are just some ideas for the types of tools and resources that can help everybody, municipalities, but also residents and volunteers take some climate action. That's everything. I think we have about 20 minutes for questions, and happy to dive in to some of the tools more if you'd like. Or other areas we can focus on. Yes, Carrie.
There we go.
Yeah.
I have a question for Jody. Did you undergo any community resilience training before you did your workshop?
Nope.
Oh,
I mean, we have a lot of talent in our town, so we leaned on people who've been executive directors and different organizations, and just recruited people with experience in facilitating. We didn't come with the answers, we came with questions, mostly for the community.
okay. Thanks.
Wait, Danny said, a lot of opportunity for BIL grants. So the state actually has a great BIL is the bipartisan infrastructure law that was passed, I don't know, 2 years ago, year and a half ago now. And there are finally, lots of funding opportunities coming. The state has a great website that I will drop in the chat now that highlights all of the opportunities coming from that. It's really hard to, I will say honestly, as somebody who does this day in and day out, evaluating funding opportunities, it is very hard to match projects and funding opportunities. So for anybody that feels very frustrated and like they don't understand, it's not just you, it is a very challenging thing. A lot of these funding opportunities have different eligibility requirements, different technical requirements, and it is not easy to like have your perfect project that you think of and then find the exact funding opportunity that might match it. So what I generally encourage is to take a look at some of, especially the main bipartisan infrastructure law website. They break it down sort of by putting it in the chat right now by sectors. So, looking at transportation, I think a lot of this funding, especially I think the transportation is very complex because it comes in formula funding. So DPCOG does distribute formula funds. So, the state gets a certain amount of money, it goes through very defined processes. So it's not like there's just like free money floating around that people can grab for a really great transportation idea that they have. There's like very specific ways in which it's just distributed across the state. That doesn't mean that there's not opportunities. There definitely is. So please don't be discouraged. I just think with a lot of the federal funding opportunities, it is more complex than people think that like, oh, there should be a bunch of money, and there is, and it's coming in lots of different ways. But it's not always just there ready to be taken. And Victoria and Chloe, you guys do this a lot as well. So if you have advice for community members on how to best access this information, please do share. Other questions? I will also highlight too, like the Community Resilience Partnership and a few of the state DACF, other smaller funding opportunities are really great for planning grants. So, I know there are a couple different newsletters that you can get on that have great funding opportunity information. I think that's always a good place to start. Yeah. Okay, other questions? All right, not a very talkative group today. Jim Newman, you want to elaborate?
Sure. First, let me just say hi, Sarah.
Hi, it's so nice to see you. I feel like it's been so long.
So funny. Previous lives.
Previous lives, yeah.
Took me a moment. I was like, wait, your name is all truncated. So we do a lot of work at Linnea. I'm a consultant, hey. But we do a lot of work in communities around Maine. We actually led One Climate Future. And in Massachusetts as well, and various other places. But in a lot of these cases, and we're finding, especially with smaller communities, that we've kind of moved away from really doing plans so much as really like, okay, we know there's going to be 3 or 4 things. Denny just did a great job of like, okay, you're a residential community. This is the stuff you probably need to be thinking about, and moving toward, and how do we do that? How do we do that here? And so that's where we spend the energy and figuring it out. And it's, I kind of recommend it for communities. It's the planning is really great, and it's a good way to get people engaged, but people want to see action. And so anyway, that was all.
Yeah. No, that's great advice, Jim. When I first started our municipal outreach and talking about climate action planning, I had a grand plan of doing like short 6 month or 3 or 4 month plans where we like just got everything together and started acting. And the thing that we've seen in our communities is all of that is still happening, you know, as we're in Freeport, we're doing a climate action plan and they're looking to vote to adopt the stretch code soon. So there are things like, I think you're right, like highlighting, I wouldn't call it low-hanging fruit because it's still, a lot of these things are really hard to do, but highlighting actions that you know are going to need to be taken regardless, you know, as you're doing, you can plan in the long term and take really quick, decisive action on things that you have community support for. And I think that's a great point. It makes people feel good to see action being taken too, and that like things are being accomplished.
Yeah, and it's kind of a place you can start. There are things that take time.
Yep.
Again, as Denny was talking about, the sort of the electrification of heating. It's like that's not going to happen next year, but you can start, and it can start to build momentum. The real question is, how do you do it in your community? What works for you?
Yeah, exactly. And letting your sort of community values drive that. And that's where I think the engagement is really helpful. And Jody, what you all did to see, what are the priorities in a community? Like you can put a workshop together and get that sense, you don't necessarily need to do a year-long planning process to get that answer. So I think that's a great message. Carrie.
So we're thinking of doing a climate action plan as part of our comprehensive plan.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a lot of communities out there doing this strategy?
Yeah, we have communities that are interested. I think you can absolutely do that. Like there's no reason, and I think that can always be a good combination with like what Jim was talking about really clear actions. I think a lot of times a comp plan is sort of like a 50,000 right like view of things, and so setting a vision and values around sustainability and climate action in your community is you can do that through a comp planning process. I think it's like then getting down into the nitty-gritty details of how you're going to achieve those is what climate action plans or an implementation section could be good for. So just making sure that that would be my advice, is that you can totally do that. And it's great to roll into your company because you're already engaging the community in such a deep way, and getting feedback that just like making those the same conversation is really good, instead of separating into like, this is climate action, this is comp planning, like it can all be the same thing. I would just encourage you to then, think deeply about how do you incorporate into your comp plan some milestones and key places where that you can check in and making sure you're making progress on identifying the really kind of nitty-gritty details of the actions that will achieve.
Yeah, we're thinking of weaving it into the community resilience within all chapters of the plan, that but also having a separate chapter for probably, like you said, implementation and stuff like that. And so we're just starting our process.
Great. Yeah, it's really exciting. And there are Thomaston, I think they have a good example of a comp plan that has a lot of climate action. Is it Thomaston? I don't know.
No, I've heard Nobleboro has done a really good job. We have a lot of issues with sea level rise in our town. So we have marshes that are very vulnerable to that. So it's a process. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for being here. Great. I don't see any additional questions. So we have, and Chloe put some links in the chat as well for funding opportunities and information, which is really helpful. And our reference document is there as well. So we'll have this has been recorded and we will have slides, the reference links and the recording will go out via email to everybody that registered. Is that right, Julia? Is that what we're doing? Yeah, perfect. So yeah, for those that couldn't make it today, or if you want to reference some of the slides, we'll have that all out to everybody. Great. Well, thank you all for being here today and appreciate your time. And please do reach out to any one of us if you have questions.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Tim.